Hi everyone, I'm Yusuf Jazakallah. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Recruitment Smart. I would like to welcome everybody to our first webinar, which focuses on diversity and inclusion in the workplace and how AI can play a role in enabling that. So thank you for joining us in today's webinar. If you have any questions, please use the Ask Q&A button that you can see on the screen. So today, we'll be taking a deep dive into the role of artificial intelligence and how it can help create a more diverse and inclusive workforce. So let me introduce our speaker, Celia. She has 30 years of experience in international business and HR, and along with a portfolio of non-exec director roles, she is a veteran and a thought leader in the human resources industry. Her role has been instrumental in supporting Recruitment Smart's mission to help customers build a bias-free talent ecosystem by leveraging the power of AI, and she is the perfect speaker for today's webinar topic. Now, without further ado, let us all welcome our speaker, Celia. Over to you, Celia.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, and thank you everybody for joining us. I only want to briefly talk about the areas that we're going to cover today. We want to cover what diversity and inclusion actually is and the challenges that that gives to an organisation, and then talk a little bit about some of the potential interventions that can interrupt this bias. And then I'm just going to summarise and give some conclusions and time for questions from anybody. So without further ado, if I can go on to talking first of all about diversity and inclusion. What is it and why is it necessary? So diversity and inclusion, I think everybody that's on this seminar will say, well, actually, I know what diversity and inclusion is, so I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I think I just want to really emphasize that diversity has to go hand in hand with inclusion. So diversity is all about the differences between us as human beings that are both visible and not visible. But inclusion centres around cultivating a collaborative and supportive work environment. And so any employee that joins, whatever their differences are, should feel that they can do their best job in that organisation. And so really, if you look at diversity and inclusion, diversity is really about inviting people to the dance, but inclusion is asking them to dance. So it's a subtle difference, but you can't have one without the other. So why does diversity and inclusion matter in the workplace? Well, I've listed a number of things here on the slide, and I'll talk about a few of them, about why it matters. And social justice, I mean, I think this one is it's a bit of a given. It's unethical to have processes in your organisation, recruitment and development, for instances, that don't ensure that progression and career development is made on the basis of potential talent and no other rationale. It's just, it should be a given in this type of society that we live in. And if we don't have those types of processes, then it can result in us appointing the wrong people and missing out on people that could have been really beneficial to the organisation, and you waste some of the talent that you've got in your organisation, which I think particularly at the moment where a lot of companies are suffering from turnover and difficulties in attracting and retaining people, nobody can afford to have wasted talent. The other thing of, well, why does it matter, is that there's quite a lot of research that talks about the fact that if you've got diversity in your thinking of your workforce, and the demographics of your workforce are very varied, then you should be able to improve performance, because you should have more innovation and different ideas and ways to tackle problems. But of course, all of this, it's not just about the diversity, but this particularly is about inclusion, making sure that your work environment does support people that come in with a diverse background. And if you don't have that type of culture in your organisation, then actually that impacts on the well-being of staff, because people do notice and they do want everybody to be treated in an even playing field. And therefore, there is quite a lot, particularly once again at the moment, of making sure you retain people, is people want to work in an environment which is welcoming of all of the backgrounds of people that come into the workplace, and respects and treats people in a way that allows them to contribute best to the organisation. And so, once again, in terms of, we've talked a bit about the diversity. It isn't just about, well, we want to be good citizens. It is that there is quite a lot, once again, of research that talks about the fact that if you do improve the diversity and the inclusion of your workforce, particularly in a lot of service-based organisations, say, for instance, National Health Service, that customer care does improve. And of course, nobody wants to work in an organisation that doesn't obey the law. So compliance is also key. There's a lot of downsides in terms of, if you don't obey the law on this, then you can get some big fines as well if you are found to be employing people or letting people go in a discriminatory manner. So I think there's lots of reasons of why it matters in the workforce. So the challenges that you might face in actually getting to a diverse inclusion. So the top diversity and challenges that are faced are ensuring, sorry, I need the slide moved on, thank you. The top diversity and challenges faced, what I've tried to do here is give some of the challenges that are faced, which are due to the processes that are within an organisation, and some around the cultural aspects, which is really around inclusion. Because as I said at the beginning, diversity is fine, but you can have a very diverse workforce that doesn't stay very long because you've not got an inclusive culture. So in terms of the processes, one of the key things is you can only recruit a diverse workforce if you actually have a diverse applicant pool. And so one of the key things in terms of ensuring that you get that is making sure that you use different channels for advertising. You can use specialist recruitment firms. Another key is making sure that you aren't too rigid on job requirements and specifications. This doesn't mean that I'm saying, compromise on the quality and talent that you're bringing in. What I mean by that is sometimes you can put on a job specification that it is essential, for instance, that you have an engineering degree. But in actual fact, it may be that you have people applying, they don't have an engineering degree, but they've got very good experience that they've they have gained within, for instance, the army, where they've held an engineering position, got that experience. So is actually an engineering degree really necessary? And it's some of those things that you need to just make sure that you're not putting barriers that could mean some diverse candidates don't apply, even though they would be very good within the role. I'm going to talk a little bit later in more detail on some of the recruitment processes and talk about some of the biases. So I won't linger on that at the moment. But I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other issues faced, which are around inclusion. I think that one of the things that people sometimes forget is if you have a diverse workforce coming in, so different ages, different ethnicities, different languages, then you need to consider your communication styles. Communication and how people like to communicate often differ in this type of diverse workforce, and therefore you need to make sure that your communication styles appeal and are appropriate to a diverse workforce to make sure that everybody does feel included. You also, in the same sort of vein, need to realise that there can be some cultural misunderstandings when you have diversity within the workforce. So, for instance, some gestures like thumbs up, which is seen as a positive gesture in the UK, is not necessarily in other cultures. And similarly, things like use of your left hand or patting your back is offensive in some cultures. And therefore you do need to make sure that people, when you are in this broader diverse workforce, do have some understanding of what that means to work in that diverse environment. And similarly, you can actually find that although your end point of your decision making can be improved by that diverse thinking, because you've got different views and opinions coming in, sometimes decision making can be a bit slower. And once again, it's people getting used to that and not just pushing through and forgetting they do need to take advantage of what they've got. So I think that there are so many things that you do have to think about. But one of the key elements is that if you are looking at your processes particularly, you do need to make sure that you do not have unconscious bias. So in unconscious bias, I think everybody, it's something that people have become more aware of recently. And there is a lot of training that is often provided for unconscious bias. And a lot of companies will do that training and they'll say, well, we've done that training, we should be okay, we don't need to do anything else. But it's actually quite interesting that if you actually look at the research behind unconscious bias, and unconscious bias is this whole thing where people, if you ask somebody, do you think you're biased in selection and recruitment? And they say, oh, no, I'm definitely not. But they're things that people are unaware of. And if you go through training, there's a lot of research that says that training does help, but it's actually time limited so that people will be trained. But if you go back, and I haven't found in the research exactly how long it is before that training wanes. It probably differs with different people, but there is after a time, people forget about it. And also, there is some research that actually says that some people, the people that are most positively impacted by the training are those that are most potentially aware of their unconscious bias. And those people that are not aware often don't accept it. And in actual fact, there can sometimes be a negative effect of unconscious bias training, because people will just close their minds and say, well, I don't do that. And it could have a backlash, which it's one of those things of human nature. If you tell people not to do something, then sometimes people start doing it, which is a very unfortunate, part of human behaviour. So I think that training is a good thing to do because it does raise awareness, but the key thing is to try and get unconscious bias out of your processes. So there's a lot of things that you can do on the recruitment process to interrupt bias. And so one of the things is blind hiring. So there's some research here that was done, and blind hiring is basically when on a CV or an application form, you take away details about the candidate, which may be things that people would see as stereotypical, and look at what the result is if you do that. And so there is quite an interesting paper which was and research that was done in 2003, and it was termed, "Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamail?" And it basically is research that was took part in the US, in Boston and Chicago, and they advertised roles, and the same people applied using different names. And they found that names that were associated with people that were white were 50% more likely to receive positive application results than those that had names that were associated with African Americans. And also an interesting thing there was that they also found that there was more response, positive response, dependent on the area that you lived. And that was totally ethnically not associated. It didn't matter what your name was, but if you were from what was seen as a poorer area, as a richer area, you were more likely to get applications if you were from that richer area. So it does suggest that it is a good thing to take some of these details off. So clues to gender, to race, to schools, and that then makes people, recruiters, focus on the candidate's skills and the prior work experience, not any other details which are not relevant to the role. So how can artificial intelligence help you with this? Well, one of the things, as I said, with looking at unconscious bias is that if you ask people if they feel that they are biased, everybody denies it. And it's particularly found that where you've got very analytical roles, those analytical people are more likely to be very much resistant to saying that they have got any biases. Artificial intelligence can really help because it can take out that human, well, first of all, it can check what your recruitment processes are. So it can check to see whether you do have some biases in your recruitment by running through the data, looking at the skills, looking at the roles, and trying to see whether any unconscious biases can be identified in your processes already. It can then, that's the first thing, which it says, well, have you got that issue, and help you look to how you might rectify it. You can also then develop algorithms that support the good decision making based on the skills, the requirements of the role, and gets rid of that human error and combats any systemic biases. So it's very much, it is very analytical, very factually based. Now, everybody's also heard that, well, AI, there's problems because AI is always going to be biased. No, it doesn't have to be biased. What AI has to be controlled and monitored, and the algorithms have to be looked at and double checked and made sure that there are no design errors or biases in the underlying data that it's derived from, because otherwise those biases will go through. So it's key when putting the algorithms together that you are able to then look to check that there isn't some unintended consequence. But it's much easier to do that if you've got a computerized system that can go through, and you can then check exactly what is coming out at the end, and you can modify that rather than having to potentially train the myriad of recruiters that you have within your organization that may not even be aware of what their biases are. So I think the key for artificial intelligence within recruitment processes is analysis of the data to start with, to see where your starting point is, and ensuring that whatever you put in is then very carefully implemented and monitored to ensure that no bias is coming through into your final process. So in summary, the key thing with regard to diversity and inclusion is, in my view, making sure that you remove, first of all, bias from the systems and processes that you have for recruitment. It's not just training to remove bias from individuals. The processes have got to be clean. There's got to be accountability at all levels in the organisation, because, as I've mentioned before, that diversity is what we're aiming for, but without inclusion, then you won't keep a diverse workforce, and you won't gather all the benefits of having a diverse workforce. Ensuring that communication is essential, and that any changes that you need to make in the organisation, you make and enhance your organisation, ensuring that the workplace climate is conducive to a diverse workforce. So, as I mentioned before, I think diversity, and all of us want a diverse workforce. AI can help you to do that, but without changing or maintaining a inclusive culture within your workforce, diversity won't be sustainable. So that's what I wanted to say. I don't know whether you have any questions that you want to ask.
Thank you very much, Celia. Let me just check if there are any questions from any of the guests. So,
yeah, nice.
Yeah, the question is that, what are the different, there's one question which has been asked, what are the different parameters, which organizations need to consider in reducing the bias?
I don't quite understand the question.
I can probably take that one, guys. So, so I think when you're talking about, if this question is related to the way algorithms and AI can play a role, and the parameters which need to be considered in reduction of bias, if I'm understanding that correctly, then I think one thing which is very clear is that there is no way to remove 100% bias. I mean, that's just not possible to do. So instead, what we do is we try and measure, the key criterias and the key parameters which are indeed measurable, which are the tangibles. So some of the things that we can measure in terms of bias is obviously the name example, right? So when we are considering a particular candidate for recruitment, are we taking into account, the name, and is there any bias introduced because of that? So I think that's something that is very tangible, and that's something that can be incorporated into the recruitment processes. So another criteria is a gender. Again, that's something that when a human is looking at a CV, there is a possibility of introducing bias in that process where certain jobs are considered to be more favorable for certain genders. So again, that's something that can be easily measured, and it's a tangible parameter that can be used when you're designing algorithms. So you can design algorithms to basically not consider all these key areas or key parameters which are considered to be introducing a bias in the system. So you measure, so especially if you're looking for technology candidates for a technology role, then you are specifically only analyzing the things like the skills that the candidate has. You're analyzing, the certifications and the qualifications that a particular candidate has. And you are not particularly looking at some of the parameters which are introducing bias into the process. So that's something that can be very much be done in an algorithmic way. And that's something that we are doing at the moment. Yeah. So I think there's one more question which is asked by Vikram. How do we ensure that the machine learning is not tainted on previous hiring trends? So I think this is again a very good question. So the key thing is that the way you do it is, first of all, what is the bias, right? So you create a funnel of recruitment where each stage of the process you measure, the diversity index. So you create something called as a diversity index, which measures all the key parameters that the organization is looking for, and effectively you are measuring that across the whole funnel. And if the diversity index is coming to be consistent across across all the different types of the funnel, then effectively what we can say is that there is no bias in that particular process. So for example, just to give you an example, if for a given role at the start of the funnel, if the ratio of, for example, gender, so male versus female is 60-40, and throughout the whole process, of shortlisting, interviewing, any further rounds and final selection, if the ratio remains the same through the whole process, and what this means is that there is no particular bias in the system. So now if you want to improve this process, what we can do is if we change the ratio at the top of the funnel and make it 50-50, then effectively the whole system becomes extremely fair. So that's what I mean. So when you're doing your machine learning, when you're training the system, you are making sure that you are measuring the diversity index at each point of the training, and you're monitoring that, as Celia had mentioned earlier. So it's that you monitor that and you ensure that you're not introducing bias at step one. So I think that's something which is very important, and I think that was covered in this slide, where you need to have careful implementation and monitor that at all points. Yeah, I think that's all the time that we have for today. So thank you everybody for joining today. We are indeed recording this session as well. And we will be sharing the recording later on to people who joined late or who could not join for this podcast. Thank you very much and have a great day. Thanks, Celia, for this presentation.